We just finished talking about villains, so it only makes sense to cover the definition of evil: being bad, doing immoral behavior, causing unnecessary pain and suffering, a net negative on the world. Evil is the opposite, or sometimes the absence, of good. Obviously, it's a super broad concept, and so many philosophies and religions really focus on the battle between good and evil. Whether or not it's blamed on a supernatural force, typically forms of evil involve unbalanced behavior such as anger, revenge, hatred, trauma, selfishness, ignorance, destruction, and neglect. So in the West, of course, we have very firm definitions, right? Good is angelic and evil is demonic. Cool. However, in the East, if you look at Buddhism or even Hinduism, both good and evil sometimes are perceived as part of a duality that itself must be overcoming all suffering by achieving nirvana, so transcending both good and evil. So let's go ahead and explore the nature of good and evil, how we ought to behave, and how we navigate complex moral issues. Perhaps a really interesting quote about the nature of this complex subject is from Baruch Spinoza, an Age of Enlightenment philosopher of Jewish origin, and he stated, quote, "By good I understand that which we certainly know is useful to us. By evil, on the contrary, I understand that which we certainly know hinders us from possessing anything that is good." It can be subjective, I guess, but let's explore some psychological experiments, okay? Let's go through one that was conducted in August 1971, a 2-week simulation of a prison environment that examined the effects of situational variables on participants' reactions and behaviors. Participants were recruited from the local community with an ad in the newspaper offering $15 a day, which, good gosh, is worth $113 today, to male students who wanted to participate in a psychological study of prison life. After being chosen, they were assigned being prisoners or prison guards. The guards were given uniforms specifically to de-individuate them, and they were instructed to prevent prisoners from escaping. The experiment officially started when prisoners, quote, were arrested by real Palo Alto police. And over the following 5 days, remember this is supposed to be a 2-week study, psychological abuse of the prisoners by the guards became increasingly brutal. Okay, now there's a lot of criticism of this study, which is the Stanford prison experiment, infamous, and it's criticized as being unscientific and fraudulent, but it is very interesting in terms of human behavior and perhaps what is evil. The official goal of the experiment was, quote, to see what the psychological effects were of becoming a prisoner or prison guard. To do this, we decided to set up a simulated prison and then carefully note the effects of this institution on the behavior of all those within its walls. Focusing on the power of roles, rules, symbols, group identity, and situational validation of behavior that generally would repulse ordinary individuals. Again, this study had a lot of flaws, such as demand bias, when the participants might have subconsciously changed their behavior to fit whatever they thought were the intended consequences of the experiment. In addition, the folks that were selected for becoming guards also had traits associated with abusiveness, perhaps like aggression, authoritarianism, Machiavellianism, social dominance, and narcissism, and also showcased low empathy and altruism. I mean, this experiment is nuts. Like, this happened at Stanford. This is crazy. This would not exist today. This is totally unethical. The experiment was conducted in a 35-foot section of the basement of Jordan Hall, the psychology building, and the prison had 2 fabricated walls, one at the entrance and one at the cell wall to block observation. Each cell was 7 feet by 10 feet, and it was unlit, so it was intended to house 3 prisoners and had a cot with a mattress, sheet, and pillow for each prisoner. They were confined and they were supposed to stay in their cells and the yard all day and night until the study was finished. The guards, on the other hand, again, these are all volunteers, but it's pretty crazy how quickly they really owned their roles. They had wooden batons, actual prison guard uniforms, mirrored sunglasses to prevent direct eye contact, and they were given breaks and allowed to leave the experiment room for resting. They were also given instructions to be tough and rough and call the prisoners by number rather than by name. I mean, the more and more I go into this study, it's actually nuts. So these folks were arrested without warning, so the first breach of ethics in terms of the own contract, and this is because Professor Zimbardo wanted it to come as a surprise. The Palo Alto Police Department actually read them their Miranda rights, fingerprinted them, took mugshots, and systematically strip searched them and gave them new identities with their inmate identification number and uniform. By 2:30 a.m., the second day, this is right after midnight, the prisoners already rebelled against the guards' wake-up calls of whistles and clanging of batons. The prisoners, again these volunteers, refused to leave their cells to eat in the yard, ripped off their inmate number tags, took off their stocking caps, and insulted the guards. And again, there's nothing really happening except these two groups of volunteers interacting with each other. And in response, guards sprayed fire extinguishers at the prisoners to reassert control. The guards then proceeded to remove all of their clothes, removed mattresses, and sentenced the main instigators to time in the hole. One of the guards, quote, said, "These are dangerous prisoners." And it got worse. By day 3, guards started abusing the inmates. They had the prisoners count off and do push-ups, restricted access to the bathroom, and forced them to relieve themselves in a small bucket in their own cells. By day 4, one of the volunteer prisoners had a mental breakdown and he left the study. By day 5, which was scheduled for visitations from friends and families to simulate the prison experiments, loved ones were actually super worried about their son's well-being and whether they had enough to eat. Thank gosh, because Professor Zimbardo's girlfriend, Christina Meslick, also visited the prison, and she was super distressed after observing the guards abusing the prisoners, and she challenged Zimbardo about the immorality of the study and his lack of oversight. Good thing she arrived, because the following day, Philip Zimbardo canceled the study. So conclusions and observations from this flawed and deeply troubling study were largely subjective and anecdotal. And even though it's been used to illustrate cognitive dissonance, right, and the power of authority, the participants' behavior may have been shaped by knowing that they were being watched, aka the Hawthorne effect. Instead of being restrained by fear of an observer, guards may have behaved more aggressively when supervisors observing them did not step in to restrain them. Okay, so that's one experiment I wanted to share, and this is again commonly taught in most psychological literature. So there's another study that happened a little bit earlier, also in August, in 1961 at Yale University. It was intended to measure the willingness of study participants to obey an authority figure who instructed them to perform acts conflicting with their personal conscience. Participants were led to believe that they were assisting an unrelated experiment in which they had to administer electric shocks to a, quote, learner. These were fake electric shocks, but they were gradually increased to levels that would have been fatal had they been real. It was led by Yale University psychologist Stanley Milgram to answer the popular contemporary question post-World War II due to the trial of German Nazi war criminal Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. The question was, quote, could it be that Eichmann and his million accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? Could we call them all accomplices? Okay, so this study was similarly nuts. So there were 3 people involved in each session, which was 1, the experimenter, who was in charge of the session, 2, the teacher, which was the volunteer, right? They were led to believe that they were merely assisting, whereas in actuality, they were the subjects of the experiment. And the last person, who was another Confederate, part of the study, who was the learner, who pretended to be a volunteer. So the teacher, which is the actual volunteer, and the learner were taken into a room where the learner was strapped into what appeared to be an electric chair. The experimenter would be dressed in a lab coat in order to have more authority and told the participants that this was to ensure that the learner would not escape. Again, those two folks are actors. At some point prior to the actual test, the teacher, which is the volunteer, right, the person that we're studying, was given a sample electric shock from the electroshock generator in order to firsthand experience what the shock could feel like. The teacher and the learner were then separated so that they could communicate but not see each other. Okay, so the person delivering the shock, which is our volunteer, who's the actual subject of the study, unknown to them, and the learner, who is an actor that is pretending to be wounded when delivered a fake electric shock. Okay, then the teacher was then given a list of word pairs that he was to teach the learner. The teacher would begin by reading the list of word pairs and then read the first word and read 4 possible answers. The learner would press a button to indicate his response, and if it was incorrect, the teacher would administer a shock to the learner, with the voltage increasing with each wrong answer. The volts range from 15 to 450, right? From slight shock to danger, severe shock. And this is included in verbal markings. And the learner, who's again hidden from the person administering the shocks, would act and scream in pain, and ultimately, when the highest voltages were reached, would fall silent. Okay, just to situate ourselves again, the teacher is the person reading the questions and delivering shocks if there are incorrect answers. The learner is hidden from this person and is administered the shocks if they're given incorrect answers, and the experimenter is the one pushing the teacher to continue on with the experiments. So the experimenter and the learner are the actual scientists helping conduct the study, or the Confederates. So the experimenter would give specific verbal commands, such as, in this order: 1, please continue; 2, the experiment requires that you continue; 3, it is absolutely essential that you continue; and 4, you have no other choice. You must go on. The experiment was halted after the subject had elicited the maximum 450-volt shock 3 times in succession. Okay, now, before the study was conducted, Milgram polled several psychology majors, psychiatrists, and teachers on their predictions for the study, and all of them had less than 4% of subjects continuing with the high-voltage shocks. Milgram himself suspected before the experiment that the obedience exhibited by Nazis during the Holocaust reflected their German identity, and he planned to use American participants as a control group. However, he didn't move forward because of the unexpected results from the American participants. Okay, now, Milgram noted that all subjects were uncomfortable administering the shocks and were sweating, trembling, stuttering, biting their lips, groaning, digging their fingernails, and having nervous laughing fits or seizures. Okay? And he wrote that, quote, I set up a simple experiment at Yale University to test how much pain an ordinary citizen would inflict on another person simply because he was ordered to by an experimental scientist. Stark authority was pitted against the subject's strongest moral imperatives against hurting others, and with the subject's ears ringing with the screams of the victims, authority won more often than not. I mean, ethically, this is a nuts experiment too. The very fact that they knew they were delivering basically fatal shocks to people and still continued, even though it was an experiment, it's absolutely nuts. So can this actually compared and used to assess genocide? A lot of people say no. And here's a couple of reasons why. So number one, the subjects of the experiments were assured in advance that no permanent physical damage would result from their actions. However, genocide perpetrators were fully aware of their hands-on killing of victims. Number two, the lab subjects actually did not know their victims and were not motivated by racism, right? Holocaust perpetrators displayed an intense devaluation of the victims through a lifetime of personal development. Number three, as opposed to the Stanford prison experiment, those serving out punishment here were actually not sadists or hate mongers and exhibited great anguish and conflict in the experiment, unlike the horrific designers and executioners of the final solution, right? They had a clear goal on their hands set beforehand. And number 4, the experiment lasted for an hour with no time for the subjects to contemplate the implications of their behavior, whereas the Holocaust lasted for years, with ample time for a moral assessment of all individuals involved. Now, when we study history here in the West, talks of unethical human experimentation is usually relegated to the last common enemy that we faced, which is in World War II, and I'm talking about we in the American perspective of the Nazis and Imperial Japan, and it's truly disgusting. But as you can see, unethical human experimentation exists in the United States. We can look at war crimes in Vietnam or Iraq. Abu Ghraib actually comes to mind. Now, there are some really disgusting and disturbing things that happened at this prison. Originally, it was a prison of Saddam Hussein, and it was notorious for being extremely violent, executions without any warning, and high incidence of torture. When the U.S. military took it over, a lot of those policies continued. And I think in light of everything that we've just discussed, like we talked about experiments, I think it's important to see what's actually happening in the real world. And before I start this, I must state that I am a huge supporter of the American military, our armed men and women, and I just want to quote Brigadier General Mark Kimmett, who said of the prison actions of some of these folks in Iraq, and quote, he said, "The first thing I'd say is we're appalled as well. These are our fellow soldiers. These are the people we work with every day, and they represent us. They wear the same uniform as us, and they let their fellow soldiers down. Our soldiers can be taken prisoner as well, and we expect our soldiers to be treated well by the adversary, by the enemy. And if we can't hold ourselves up as an example of how to treat people with dignity and respect, we can't ask that other nations do that to our soldiers as well. So what would I tell the people of Iraq? This is wrong. This is reprehensible. But this is not representative of the 150,000 soldiers that are over here. I'd say the same thing to the American people. Don't judge your army based on the actions of a few." So let's talk about these actions. This prison facility held an estimated 8,000 detainees. And remember, this is total war. There was a time in which war was fought between nation states and just militaries, but increasingly in the 20th and 21st centuries, everything is at war. It's total war, especially when you're taking over a country. Everyone and everything is suspect. So of course, people are in high stress situations, both the civilians and the soldiers. There are disgusting reports that came out, everything from leashing prisoners like dogs, herding them like sheep, repeatedly assaulting them physically, emotionally, and sexually, handcuffing prisoners in extremely uncomfortable situations, such as being handcuffed behind their back and hanging from the ceiling, using ferocious military dogs to scare bound prisoners, extreme sleep deprivation in which prisoners were moved from cell to cell to cell to interfere with their sleep cycle, hooding prisoners, playing extremely loud music in their cells so they couldn't communicate, sleep, or rest, removing all of their clothing. This was very common. They'd have them sit in human pyramid style and take photos of them. The soldiers would actually pose in front of naked prisoners in stress positions, as well as dead prisoners that had died from torture, smearing excrement across prisoners' bodies and faces, electrocuting prisoners, making them stand for unsustainable periods, and systematic rape and sexual humiliation. So we started off by talking about evil. We talked about these psychological experiments. We just talked about a real-world example in contrast to the Holocaust and the Asian Holocaust, right? The rape of Asia, essentially, by Imperial Japan. But also, I just wanted to highlight what's happening in much more recent history. We talk about these things as if they're history, and we talk about these things as if they're not present in our own country. When we look at the concept of genocide, there are typically 10 stages, and I'm going to go through them right now. So first off is classification, when people are divided into them and us. Then comes symbolization, which is when combined with hatred, symbols may be forced upon unwilling members of undesired groups. 3 would be discrimination, right? When actual law or cultural power excludes groups from full civil rights. So this is segregation or apartheid laws, denial of voting rights, okay? Number 4 is when it gets really ugly, right? Dehumanization, when one group denies the humanity of the other group. Members of it are equated with animals, vermin, insects, or disease. Number 5 is when it gets even more scary. Organization. Genocide is always organized. Special army units or militias are often trained and armed. Number 6 is polarization, when extremists drive the groups apart, leaders are arrested, murdered, and laws erode fundamental civil rights and liberties. And there's preparation, which is when mass killing is planned. Victims are identified and separated because of their ethnic or religious identity. Then comes persecution, right? Forced displacement, ghettos, concentration camps. Number 9 is extermination. It is extermination to the killers because they do not believe their victims to be fully human, right? Same species, not believing that the other is part of the same species. That's nuts. And then 10, as we come back into the world today, is denial. The perpetrators deny that they committed any crimes. We have to thank Gregory Stanton, a researcher, the founding president of Genocide Watch, who came up with this list to explain how genocides occur. And if you paid attention to it, I think you can identify examples in the real world today. You just need to look at social media, for example, to find evidence of misogyny, racism, bigotry. That could reflect some of the early stages of genocide. So bringing it back to the discussion of evil, most people would agree that some of the events that we discussed display characteristics of what we would consider evil. Now, religions have their own concepts of good and evil, right? For us in the Western world, the Christian Bible, it's pretty clear, like Satan, the fallen angels, they are evil. They lead humans astray. They are the tempters and challengers of our faith in God. Cool. If you look at Jewish theology, however, the existence of evil is presented as part of the idea of free will. Because if humans were created to be perfect, always and only doing good would actually not mean much. For Jewish theology, it's actually important for humans to have the ability to choose the path of goodness, especially in the face of temptation and the inclination to do evil. It's still pretty complex to define because it can be subjective, right? Like, what do people actually find good and what do they despise? And what really is good and what it really is bad? As Shakespeare said, quote, "There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so." I mean, this is wild because things like murder and slavery are almost universally considered evil. Yet, up until the mid-19th century, most countries practice some form of slavery. So views on the nature of evil tend to fall into some of these camps. So one would be moral absolutism, which holds that good and evil are fixed concepts established usually by a deity, right? Nature, morality, common sense, etc. And moralism claims that good and evil are meaningless, that there is no moral ingredient in nature. This would just take the stance that we are animals with no ethics. Moral relativism holds that standards of good and evil are only products of local culture, custom, or prejudice. Okay, so that there are significant cultural differences in what you would consider good and evil. And moral universalism is the attempt, by some scholars, to find a compromise between the absolutist sense of morality and the relativist view. right? Morality is only flexible to a degree, and that what is truly good or evil can be determined by examining what is commonly considered to be evil amongst all humans. Plato himself wrote that there are relatively few ways to do good, but there are countless ways to do evil, which can therefore have a much greater impact on our lives and the lives of other beings capable of suffering. Going off of this, there was an American psychiatrist, M. Scott Peck, who defined the following characteristics about an evil person. They are consistently self-deceiving with the intent of avoiding guilt and maintaining a self-image of perfection. They deceive others consistently. They psychologically project their evils onto very specific targets, scapegoating them. They commonly hate with the pretense of love. They abuse political or emotional power. They maintain a high level of respectability and lie consistently, and they're consistent in their evil actions, and they're unable to think from the viewpoint of their victim, and they are intolerant to criticism. Now, this in itself brings up the concept of necessary evil, right? Or choosing the lesser of two evils. I think a recent example of this was the 2016 United States presidential election. Both major candidates, so Hillary Clinton from the Democrats and Donald Trump from the Republican Party, had disapproval ratings close to 60% by August that year, right? And really, if you ask a lot of people, at least anecdotally from my experience, like, they were just voting for the lesser of two evils. They didn't really like either candidate much. And I think this was repeated in the following presidential election, in which Biden ran against President Trump. So I do want to go further into this topic. I know it's a little dark and heavy, but I want to tie it back to the villain arc because I'm not sure if I necessarily defined evil, and I don't think it's possible to, but I wanted to tie it into this whole concept of the villain arc and what can be considered perhaps toxic people expressing toxic views on things such as masculinity, which we will 100% get into. So some people say that the villain arc is needed to truly see the good that you can accomplish. So people come into this world, they're naive, idealistic, young, happy-go-lucky, and then something happens in their life where there are extremely troubling times with disappointment, failure, fear, and crazy resentment to everything around you. If we just go into your character arc, if you decide to become a villain, you'll do evil things. You will hurt people around you and probably mess yourself up further than all the difficult things that life was throwing at you. To use the video game example, you might have been playing on hard mode. You're now playing on God mode. And things are cyclical. The snowball effect is real. If things are going well, they tend to go well. And if things are going bad, when it rains, it pours. And likely, you will be more and more alone. So it's okay to do bad things. There's not a single person on this earth without sin, if we want to call it that. If you do go through, quote unquote, your villain arc, hopefully there's a point in that in which you have some time for self-reflection, introspection about your life, where you're going, your path of hate, the effects of your actions, your legacy, the real purpose of why you're here. Because life itself is just fleeting. It's gone in the blink of an eye. It's only given meaning if you give it meaning. So why not make it a good time? Before you know it, you'll be buried under the ground. You're only here for a short time. We are nothing but blimps, barely visible on the cosmic scale. So you're going to waste that time doing evil things? I've gone into my family history for almost 4 centuries, so 400 years ago. I know the names of people, but I know nothing about them. I know my grandfather. I know what my great-grandfather looks like, but I have no idea who this man was, what he did, how he acted, what his interests were, whether or not he was a good man. Nothing, right? And that was only a couple hundred years ago. A couple hundred years from now, no one will probably know what I did. Unless someone finds this podcast, right? One day, none of this, no matter what, will not matter. But simultaneously, you can give things meaning. There's zero reason to be evil or to crawl over your fellow man, to push your brother underwater so you can pull your head above the rising tide, because the water will ultimately submerge you anyway. It's okay to be tempted by the dark side. It's okay to harness that. It's okay to be villainous. It's okay to do bad things. You see, sometimes you just need to have the experience of what your actions really can do, to see how capable you are of destruction, to see the beast that you can become. But you can channel that beast. Because in the deepest pits of dark, you should still be able to see the light shine. If you turn off all the lights in a room, all you need is a little match to see. And through all of this darkness, whatever you're struggling with, whatever the world is throwing at you, sometimes that's all you need. That little match of hope to actually become good, to do good.